Cador's Prairie and Northern Region podcast number 5, Edmonton City Centre. In this episode, we speak with Dominique about a Beaver with an engine indication, a Cessna 185 go-around, a precautionary landing in the wilderness, a laser strike on a Eurocopter, and the aerodrome that was known as Edmonton City Centre Airport. I'm Brad Crockett, a private pilot. Joining me is Dominique Prinet. Dominique has 5,000 hours in his logbook on 50 types of gliders, single-engine airplanes, twin-engine airplanes, and helicopters. These include the Cessna 180, de Havilland Beaver, de Havilland Otter, and the Beech 18. He holds an airline transport pilot license, was vice president at Nordair and Canadian Airlines, and was advisor to the CEO of Air Tanzania. Dominique has published aviation articles in Aviasport and wrote the book Flying to Extremes, Memories of a Northern Bush Pilot. Dominique, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for having invited me.
The Edmonton City Centre Airport was located in north-central Edmonton, Alberta. Established in 1927 as Blatchford Field, it was one of the first, if not the first, licensed airfield in Canada. In 1942, it had one 4,500-foot runway and two 5,700-foot runways, and it served as a military air base during World War II. It was later known as Edmonton Industrial Airport, then Edmonton Municipal Airport, and finally Edmonton City Centre Airport. The airfield was closed in 2013. Dominique, did you fly at Edmonton City Centre?
Yes, many times. During the day and during the night. I remember landing during the night. I couldn't find the airport, and there were patches of black everywhere downtown, parks and unbuilt areas and things, lights which looked like runways. And I made an approach to what I thought was the runway, and it turned out that when I was just coming in to land that it was a throughway. So I had to go around and turn on the instrument landing system and do an IFR approach because otherwise I couldn't find the runway. But most of the time we were taking off in the spring at the beginning of the float season after the airplane had been switched from wheel skis during the winter to floats. They had to be flown out from the hangar and from the downtown airport while on floats. So that requires putting the airplanes on dollies. And that's the part I really didn't like, because we were dragged at 5 or 6 o'clock in the morning before any wind started to the head of the runway when there was no traffic, lined up with the runway. And then we were sitting, or I was sitting high on this dolly above the dolly, which was in itself 1 meter above the ground. And then the pontoons and then the undercarriage that was way up above the ground and lined up with the runway, and off I tried to go. Well, as soon as you start rolling, you lose control because the surface of the runway is convex. And so on one occasion, I just rolled off the runway. There's no control on the direction, no brakes on these dollies. So I rolled off the runway and bounced onto the ground. Some of my colleagues knocked off 1 or 2 runway lights in the process. But the most dramatic takeoff I did from the municipal airport was on the dolly. I pulled off when I had enough flying speed, and I heard the hell of a bang underneath. I couldn't figure out what was happening. And when I landed in Cooking Lake next to the airport on floats and then hitchhiked back to the airport, and when I got there was a great commotion with flashing lights everywhere and fire brigade and ambulances and great commotion. So what's happening? Well, somebody must have crashed somewhere, but we can't find where. And eventually they spotted my emergency locator transmitter, which had been kicked off by the dolly during the takeoff when the brakes were activated. When I pulled off from the dolly, it probably activated the brakes on the front wheels. So the back kicked up, banged on the bottom of the pontoons. And that triggered the emergency locator transmitter, which was sitting on top of the fuselage, and it flew off and did its thing and started transmitting from the runway. Nobody could find out where the problem was. So those are my stories around the airport.
I have a couple of reports to ask you about that are not at City Center. Our first report is 2020 C-2845 on August 30th, 2020 at 1810 Zulu. After departing runway 35 at Red Deer for Hespero, a privately registered de Havilland Beaver reported an engine indication while 5 nautical miles north of the field and requested a turn into the downwind for landing. The pilot stated they did not require assistance. 4 aircraft in the circuit gave way and the Beaver landed safely. Dominique, it sounds like this pilot still had some power, or even all power, and made the decision to get back on the ground, even though they were turning into a fairly busy circuit. Was that the correct decision?
Yes, absolutely. When a pilot has a problem, the safety of the pilot and of his or her passengers is paramount. The pilot can ask for immediate return to the runway or announce a pan situation, which is not as serious as a mayday, but give him some sort of priority and then request whatever help he or she needs. For instance, request priority to land. And all the surrounding aircraft will be glad to give way and help. And that happened to me when I took off with a twin from Vancouver. I just took off and then the door flew open. There was great commotion inside and a lot of racket. Passengers were screaming. So I asked for exactly that, immediate return. And I made a U-turn and came back and landed in the opposite direction. I didn't want to go around the full circle, so I just made a U-turn, came back. There was no wind, and rolled and locked the door. So that was the procedure to follow.
Our second report is Cador's number 1994 W0489. On March 1st, 1994, at 21:05 Zulu, the Four Seasons Adventures Incorporated Cessna 185, registration Foxtrot Alpha Tango Zulu, was landing at Edmonton City Center in a crosswind. The left wingtip scraped on the runway, an overshoot was carried out, and the aircraft landed without further incident on another runway. Dominique, how should we set up for crosswind landings?
I've made hundreds of crosswind landings, but only with small aircraft or single or twin engine airplanes or high wing and low wing. With these, the usual technique is to do the approach with the wings horizontal, but the nose slightly pointing towards the wind to compensate for drift. So you do the approach in a crabbing attitude, moving sideways a little bit, and there's nothing to it. On short final, over the threshold with light aircraft, then you have to straighten up the airplane and turn the nose exactly in line with the runway, and then start side slipping, rolling the airplane into a bank towards the wind. So the side slip compensates for the drift. And now you're coming in line with the runway with a low wing towards the wing, and you land with one wheel. And that's the tricky part. You have to come in on one wheel. I've seen films of larger commercial airplanes, and they all seem to come in and crab right to the very end and to some degree straighten up before touching, but they're still touching sideways. How they manage that without tearing off the undercarriage, I don't know, but you couldn't do that on a small airplane. You better land on one wheel, or if you straighten up the airplane at the last minute, that's a little bit risky because of the effect when you kick the rudder on one side, then the airplane rolls and the wing towards the wind tends to go up. That's exactly the opposite of what you want to do. So I would still land on one wheel anyhow.
Is it different for a high wing like this 185 versus a low wing? And is it different for conventional gear versus tricycle gear?
It's the same for a conventional gear and a tricycle gear, the same technique. You come in and land on one wheel. But naturally, it's a lot more comfortable with a high wing airplane than the Cessna 185 you were mentioning earlier. So it's a lot easier with a high wing airplane, the Cessna family, for instance. And that's what I used to train students on. With a low wing airplane, you can still do it, but you got to be very careful when you get close to the ground that you flatten up the airplane a little bit so you don't drag the wingtip. And that happened to me when I was training with the students with a low wing airplane, a Jodel 4-seater. The trailing edge of the wing is very close to the ground, so about a foot off the ground. Luckily, the wingtip goes up a bit. The last third of the wingtip goes up a bit, so it's a bit easier. But still, we ended up scraping the left wing, which I never felt, it never hurt. But in the process, we tore off the lower aileron hoard. That's the part which sticks out with the cable to maneuver the aileron. And I didn't know that. Anyhow, it was so rough and so bumpy that I thought we should finish the flight and not take any more risk. And I'm glad I did that, because we would have taken off again with only one aileron, which I've never tried to do, but it doesn't look like the proper maneuver. So that's the way it's done with light aircraft, land on one wheel.
Are there any special considerations for skis, floats, or amphib floats?
I would never try a landing with a crosswind with a ski plane or a float plane, because the risk of moving sideways, either by being pushed by the wind downwind or sliding too much into wind and digging the ski in the snow or the float in the water is way too high. So the beauty of landing in the bush on floats and skis is that you can always land into wind. And if you can't land somewhere, then you land somewhere else. That's what I've done many times. There's no place to land, so you go somewhere else. And even at main airports, if it's too rough, then you land on a taxiway with a small airplane. And I've done that. I came into Gatwick one day with a light aircraft, low wing, coming from Paris. And I landed there, and it was, I think at the time there was only one runway, but the runway they offered me was at 45 or 60 degrees off the wing. It was blowing like hell. And I said, look, I'm not going to make it. So I asked if I could land on a taxiway. And I said, sure, because there was no traffic. So I landed right into it on a taxiway. There's nothing to it. You can also request to land on the grass in the middle of the airport. If you're stuck, you run out of short of fuel or running out of daylight, then you ask to land on a taxiway. You're asked to land on with a small aircraft. You land on the grass, and then you take it from there.
So if everything you said has been done, all looked after as well as it can be, and we continue with the landing, sometimes it can still happen that we get into trouble like this pilot did with one wingtip touching the ground. What advice would you give to an inexperienced pilot who suddenly finds themselves in this situation? What would you like them to remember at that moment?
Well, it's a very tricky question, because it depends on how much damage there was. If you feel that the wing has scraped the surface, or if you have time, which you don't have time, you turn 90 degrees and see on the left wing whether it touched or not, and you probably can't see the tip of the right wing, then you have to if you're not sure, but you heard the bang or his crash or something, it's probably safer to stay on the ground. If you haven't felt anything or not much, and you're bouncing, for instance, and it might find yourself out of control, then you would apply full power and immediately go around and try again. The problem is, how do you assess the damage? And I've seen a film of a large jet plane coming into land, and he dragged the wingtip, the left wingtip, and tore off without knowing the little vertical fin at the end of the wingtip. There was a part above the wing and a piece underneath the wing. And he took off either the whole lot or the part of the fin, which is below the wingtip, and didn't know about it. So he took off and went around. Well, that was fine. I mean, it turned out it was okay, and he could do the circuit and then came back to land again. But that's typical of the situation. What happens if you don't have time to look at the wingtip and see how much damage there was? So I would say, if in doubt, just stay on the ground.
What can we do to make practicing crosswind landings safe while still stretching our capabilities?
You've got to be very careful because crosswind landing is risky. And so you've got to do it very gradually. What I used to do with students is train them without crosswind to side slip and land on one wheel without crosswind. And once you get the hang of it and you can land on one wheel, then you try with a little bit of crosswind. But I wouldn't go too far because it's really taking a chance, and it's risky. So you train a little bit within your limits, and if it gets too rough, then stop training and hope you never have to do it in a really serious situation.
Our third report is 2010 C-2287. On July 11th, 2010, at 0 Zulu, a Kluane Airways to Havilland Beaver on floats, registration Foxtrot Mike Papa Sierra, on a flight from Whitehorse to Ikanu Lake Lodge, experienced engine problems. They landed on a lake at 61 degrees, 37.4 seconds north by 132 degrees, 21 minutes, 77.4 seconds west, which is north of Teslin. There was no damage and no injuries to the occupants. The pilot requested the company send the company helicopter to evacuate the passengers and bring a spare magneto and waders. The contracted AMO from Whitehorse was flown out to the aircraft location, determined that the right-hand magneto had failed, made the necessary repairs, and returned the aircraft to service. That's the end of the report. How might the pilot have contacted the company in a case like this?
That's interesting. There's many ways to do it. If you're too far from the company to contact them by VHF radio, and some companies have VHF radios, or call the airport you come from and ask them to phone the company. You can call any other airport in the neighborhood and ask them to phone your company and request some help. And I have done that. Or you can call the local air radio station on VHF, or you can call other airplanes. And I've done that too. I was stuck on the ground for weather, and an airplane went by between order. I was stuck with ice. I couldn't, the ice had moved in. I was stuck overnighting, and I called an airplane flying over and asked them to relay the message to my company that I was stuck there for 24 hours, not to worry. So that can be done through another airplane. Alternatively, if you have an HF radio, then the company would definitely have an HF radio too. You can call from far away with an HF. However, the problem with HF is that the waves bounce or are refracted rather on the ionosphere, and the ionosphere goes up and down during the day depending on the sun position, and therefore sometimes you get through and sometimes you can't. The other problem with HF antennas is that you have to have the antennas working, and on some occasions I had the radio was working properly, but I didn't have the antenna. First thing you have to do is line up the antenna, especially if it's a trailing antenna that you drag behind you, so that it's at 90 degrees from the direction of the station you're trying to call. So it's got to be at right angles from the radius towards the station. And that makes all the difference. If you're going around in circle with a HF antenna, they will hear you sometimes and sometimes they won't. So that's one problem. You're in the ionosphere in the direction of the antenna. The other thing is that you have to have an antenna, and a working antenna. And on one occasion, with an otter flying along the Arctic coast with a full load of American tourists who were flying for hours along the Arctic coast, they had been fishing for char and going back to the northeast corner of Great Bear Lake along the Arctic Circle. The weather had been so bad that we're dragging our feet and flying very close to the tundra. And it got so bad that I decided to stop. This was crazy. So I was looking for a lake, any place where I could land in a hurry, and calling the company. I couldn't get through and I couldn't figure out why. Well, then after we did find a lake and I landed and parked my passengers there for 24 hours to wait for the weather to improve, I discovered that the trailing antenna had been torn off because we had been flying too close to the ground. It caught in some rocks. So without an antenna, of course, the system doesn't work. And then another occasion, I was flying also along the Arctic coast and again with a full load of passengers, but for some reason, because the weather was so bad underneath it, we ended up trying to fly on top and the clouds got thicker and we ended up flying into the clouds. And sure enough, the clouds turned into icing condition. We picked up ice, and even with takeoff power and takeoff flaps, we couldn't maintain altitude and we're going down. And I knew the weather was bad all the way down to the ground. And we were going to hit the ground without seeing it, that close to cruising speed. So on the way down, I was calling Mayday, not to get any help from anybody, but just to tell people where we were so that they wouldn't spend days looking for the pieces. And I couldn't raise anybody. It was very frustrating. I yacked away, and couldn't raise anybody. And I discovered after we did land at virtually cruising speed, falling off the sky into a lake. So we were on pontoon, so that saved us. But it was zero visibility. It was just totally random process. It just fell into a lake. And so I discovered after we found a place to park the plane and unload the passengers, that there was an inch of ice on the HF antenna. It was a long antenna going from one wingtip to the fin and back to the other wingtip. There was an inch of ice around it. Of course, it didn't work. So I was wasting my time shouting in the wind, calling anybody. So you have to have a working antenna. That's my story.
How might the pilot have known to request that spare magneto when he did get a hold of the company?
That's easy because it happened to me also along the Arctic coast with an otter. We were flying over the Arctic Ocean along, a few miles from the shoreline over the ocean. And it was blowing like hell. And I was watching the ocean surface. It was extremely rough with white caps everywhere and streaks of water, of foam on the surface. And the engine started running very roughly. So I got really scared because you try to land in there, the airplane will probably explode on impact, or if it doesn't, it will flip instantly and in cold water at the temperature of freezing water or just about. You can't put 10 passengers in the water and hope they will survive more than a few minutes. So that would be game over. So I immediately turned towards the shoreline to try to make a crash landing on the tundra with pontoons, with this otter. And the first thing I did is change fuel tanks, and I put the fuel pump on, and I increased the mixture to full rich, and I put the carburetor heat on, and then I checked the magnetos, and I discovered that one was working, but the other one was out of sync and not working properly. So that was the problem. That was the problem with magneto. So we reached the shoreline, found the lake, landed on the lake, and I called the company on HF, set the airplane right so that the antenna would work, called the company on it. And that's what they did. They got the message that I needed a spare magneto, and they sent a spare magneto with a small plane. The company was in Yellowknife, and I was about 1,000 miles north of there, but the HF worked on the ionosphere that day. And if it doesn't, try another frequency or call somebody else and ask them to relay the information. And I mean, it took the magneto 2 days to arrive because of bad weather. They took off right away with the magneto, but they had to wait 24 hours on the way in on the lake until the weather cleared up. And the passengers were mad as hell. They were rich American tourists, and they were not used to get stuck in drizzle and freezing condition in the Arctic and stuck in an airplane on a lake in the tundra. But eventually they mellowed a little bit after 24 hours. And by the second day, they had become very friendly. We were now a team trying to survive. So the process was quite interesting.
I'd like to ask you about that decision to make a precautionary landing in the wilderness. For many pilots, a precautionary landing would be in a farmer's field or on a quiet stretch of highway with civilization nearby. For the pilot in this report and from your story, there are no farms, highways, logging roads, or help of any kind where they land. Have you made any other precautionary or forced landings in the wilderness? And if so, what would you say to a pilot having to make a decision about where to land or whether to land?
Well, that's the only type of landing I was doing for years, because there's no airport, so not even a gravel strip at the time. So you land on sandbars, or you land on rivers, or you land on lakes, or you land on very rough, rocky strips going straight up the side of a mountain. And it's just a lot of fun, and you can land wherever you want. And I was always bothered at the sort of landing at an airport, because there are so many constraints. There are air regulations to follow, and you've got to watch for traffic, and you've got to talk to people on the radio. I always found it very complicated. But on landing on the bush, you do what you want. And the trick is to spend a long time going around and checking the place before you land. And you can easily spend 10 minutes to try to figure out how you're going to land. But more importantly, how on earth you're going to take off, because landing is virtually always possible. You can see the water, for instance, in particular from the air, how deep it is. If it's muddy, you just don't try it. It's too risky. Water, river, or a lake, if it's muddy because of rocks and sandbars. But if it's clear, find out exactly where you're going to land and how you're going to taxi without hitting anything. But the problem is on takeoff, because once you're on the water, you can't see the obstacles under the water because of the reflection of the sky on the water surface. And so you don't know which way to go. You don't know where the obstacles are. So pick up some landmarks before and worry about the takeoff. Make sure you've got a plan for takeoff. And if you think you can land, but not take off, then land somewhere else in the bush, and the passengers may have to walk a few kilometers, and then so be it. You don't have to bring them to their doorstep. So plan on how to take it. It's the same thing with a helicopter. When you land in the mountain, you can always land. But the problem, if the air density is not high enough, you won't be able to take off. So it happened to me, for instance, in Beach Imo Harbor in a small community. The engine was running very roughly, and I eventually managed to fix it and spend the night pulling it apart and correcting the issue, which has to do with some plugs fouled up. So I lost power. It didn't have enough room to take off. So I had to make several trips, 1 or 2 passengers at a time, and they're part of their luggage, and then the rest of the luggage later. And I did that on short rivers in the Mackenzie Mountains on floats. It's a short strip of straight water, very shallow, with a cliff at one end and a waterfall at the other. And I told the passenger, look, we can take off, but I'll take one of you at a time. So take off with one and then come back and get the other, and then the other, and then take some of their gear and then the rest of the gear. So you have to make several trips to a larger lake. And that's how you get out. And one of my colleagues tried to take off, save time, but with 2 passengers. And of course, he hit the waterfalls and rolled the airplane into a ball. Well, they got wet, but it wasn't very deep. So they walked back to the gravel bar and waited for 2 or 3 days until somebody found they were missing and picked them up. But you have to plan on the takeoff. That's the key issue.
Our final report is 2013 C-2333 on June 17th, 2013 at 9:44 Zulu. A City of Edmonton Eurocopter EC-120B, registration Gulf Echo Papa Delta, on a local flight from Edmonton City Centre, was at 3,400 feet and 3.5 nautical miles north of City Centre when it was targeted by a green laser. Dominique, in an airplane, I expect there's a chance that the cowling can sometimes block light coming from the ground. In a helicopter, there's no cowling in front, just an instrument panel. Do you find that lasers are even more of a menace to helicopters?
They definitely are. I flew helicopters and never was subjected to a laser beam, fortunately. Neither did I on an airplane. But I fully agree with you. The helicopter is moving very slowly and steadily. The pilot is sitting in a bubble, transparent bubble. So anybody can reach the pilot very easily with the laser. It's criminal. You don't blind the pilot, because once you're hit with a laser, you're blinded for several minutes. You don't blind the pilot and hope he's going to fall off the sky with his machine and his passengers. This is totally irresponsible. And the idiots who do that should be thrown in jail. You don't. It's just like shooting at drivers on the highway. I mean, it's just insane. So this is not something to play with.
That's it for this episode. You can reach Dominique and the podcast by email at podcast@cadors.ca. Dominique, thank you very much.
You're welcome. My pleasure.
And thank you for listening as we exercise our license to learn. Please note that for the most part, Transport Canada Cadors reports contain preliminary unconfirmed data which can be subject to change. This podcast is provided by cadors.ca, not by NAV Canada or Transport Canada.